Hi, Dr. Frisbee. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we'll be asking you some questions to better understand the courses you teach, the investigations you conduct, and the thesis students you supervise with fourth year's honor specialization students. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks for asking me to do this with you guys. It's always fun. I love working with students. I grew up in Whitby, did my first 2 degrees at the University of Guelph, and then my husband and I, and then 2 kids came along. We're in the States for 20 years. Seattle, Washington. I worked at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin when we lived in Milwaukee. And then when we lived in West Virginia, I was a member of faculty at the School of Public Health at West Virginia University. And it's at WVU that I actually went back and did my PhD in political science. So I've an undergraduate degree in biomedical sciences, 1 graduate degree, 1 master's in applied economics, and then another master's and a PhD in political science. And I am now here. We moved here in 2016. Member of faculty in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine. I have a cross appointment in epidemiology and biostatistics. And I also work with and have been developing the Clinical and Translational Sciences graduate program.
All right, so could you briefly tell us what you're currently investigating?
You bet. So I have a variety of projects in which I'm currently involved as either quote-unquote the principal investigator or as a collaborator. Kind of the theme that has run through my research and kind of activities throughout my career has been analytics, whether it's kind of the applied economics approaches or the more multivariable statistics, kind of from my time as a PhD in political science, as well as School of Public Health, so kind of more epidemiologic approaches. I work with a variety of collaborators, kind of in the cardiovascular, cerebrovascular health and disease. Have several projects related to something called the Cardiovascular Health Index. We're also actually working to develop something called a brain health measure. I work with some basic science colleagues to do and have developed something called a vascular health index. And with the students, I have something called the Translational Health and Outcomes Research Lab, the THOR lab.
So what are the most commonly used pieces of equipment in your lab?
That's a good question. I actually am not a bench researcher. I don't have a wet lab. There's no clear colorless liquids or no animals see their untimely end in my laboratory. I'm what's called a dry lab, or I have a dry lab. I'm much more about data analytics, information, so hence the term dry. So my collaborators that or students that work with me won't be using a pipetter or anything like that. They'll be doing lots of time in PubMed and kind of do literature searches and systematic and scoping reviews. Students that have an analytic approach to their projects. For example, I also supervise a lot of epibiostats theses and students. They're obviously doing a lot of computer-based statistical analysis data. We do some collaboration with the geography department, so ArcGIS, those kinds of much more, again, analytic computer-based types of equipment.
And what courses do you currently teach?
I currently teach One Health 3300, Foundations of One Health. Yes! Which I love teaching. We had 120 students in it this year, which blew my mind, and that was absolutely fantastic. The other course that I'm teaching it this semester for the very first time, which is comparative approaches to health policy for the biomedical sciences. It's currently listed as One Health 4800. There are 53 brave souls in this course this semester, and it's going to be a really interesting course, and I hope a really valuable course for a lot of the students in the BMSC program. You know, a lot of us will interact with the policy system in some way, shape, or form. Probably a lot more often than we think throughout the course of our careers, and I think it's really Really important that we have an understanding of how to do that and how to do that effectively, whether it's One Health, because obviously policy and population level approaches are really key and central to what One Health is, but also whether you're going on to a career as a clinician or a healthcare provider, on research and development, in industry, all of those require interfacing with the quote-unquote policy system. So we might as well learn a little bit about it before we've got a lot of money on the line as professionals.
So I know you've described a little bit about what happens in your lab, but could you expand on or give examples about the type of work that an honors specialization student would do with you?
You bet. So I'll give you examples, and I'll do my best not to name names. Don't try to figure them out. But I currently have several students, actually, several thesis students, but I'll give you an example of a project from a One Health student, and I'll give you an example of the project from an epi, one of the epi students that is currently working with me. We have our lab meetings at 7 a.m. on Wednesday mornings. Yes, you heard that right, 7 a.m. And I've got quite a few students working with me in the Thor lab this year. The two thesis students that I mentioned, so the One Health student is working on a project that's a collaboration with a stroke physiatrist, who's a physician who treats stroke rehabilitation patients. And so we have a series of there's a series of projects, and she's working on a few of them related to outcomes post-stroke, and are there sex-based differences in outcomes, functional outcomes post-stroke, as well as are there differences, sex-based differences in cognitive impairments or cognitive return to normal cognitive functioning post-stroke. And then, so that's the One Health student, and then the epi-biostat student is working on a project that we're doing related to dementia prevention, in using a large data set, the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, and she is working on a project leading the analysis on differences in changes in cognitive function related to blood pressure.
So if there are one or two things you could tell students looking to excel in the classes that you're currently teaching, what advice would you give them?
So in terms of the classes that I currently teach, which is the One Health 3300 in the fall, and then the comparative policy in the winter semester, I think every professor, of course, likes to think that their courses are unique and special. But I do think that these courses are quite a bit different from a lot of the courses that many of the BMSC students take. They are not micro, they are not focused, they are not, about, this gap junction protein affects this and signals that and whatever. Not that my kind of course. If that's the kind of course you want, don't take my courses. I think the two courses that I teach are much more macro level at the level of entire social systems. And so excelling in those courses requires being able to kind of zoom out a little bit, if you will, and think about systems and think about how systems interact at the level of entire communities, at the level of entire populations. So being able to think at that level, critically evaluate, and think about also time, how things change over time, is really important.
So what are the top 3 things you look for in a prospective thesis student?
Show up Wednesday mornings at 7 a.m. So that's number 1. No, in all honesty, I think that I don't do a rigorous I don't do a rigorous interview process for potential students. Showing up at 7 a.m. also often is enough. In all seriousness aside, I do strongly encourage all students to start thinking about if you know you're going to do a research thesis or you want to do an undergrad thesis, please start thinking about that no later than second semester of your third year. Coming in quote unquote cold to a project in your fourth year is tough. It's tough on the advisor, it's also tough on the students because there's just so much stress about getting your timeline done. So I do find that it's often easier and it goes much better for the student as well as the advisor if you actually start thinking about and having those conversations in third year. In terms of, now, if that means, if a student knocks on my door in September, am I going to tell them to get lost? Of course not. But in terms of what I'm looking for in a student that wants to take on a project, one, they've got to have a genuine interest. They really need to want to be doing the kind of work and the kind of projects that I've got. They've got to be prepared to work on a team. Almost none of my projects are one-offs and or a single student working by themselves. So they've got to be able to work in teams and want to work in teams, and just keep going, right? Problem solve, be creative, and research. 90% of research is about solving the next problem. And so there's really a lot of problem solving and troubleshooting, and this didn't work, so let's try it this way. And that goes for dry lab or wet lab.
So what has been the favorite part of your research?
My favorite part of research? Seeing students get their first publications. That's pretty damn slick. I think I just swore, sorry. I mean, you get to a point as a researcher where yes, continuing to publish is obviously still important to you, but you get to the point where, okay, so I've published my own papers as first author, as senior author, and it really becomes, and so, not that the shine ever wears off that, but it becomes even more gratifying to see when students and trainees get their first papers. And I've had, the very good fortune to be able to work with some students that really have, right? They've really gone, they've really pushed, they've really worked hard. And over the last couple years, I've had several students get their papers published, and that's really, really cool. And I'll put a little plug in for my former PhD student who's now doing a postdoc in epidemiology. She just had her main paper from her dissertation accepted. And that was an enormous amount of work, right? Like a PhD is a lot of work. So to be able to see her get that published as her first author in a very good journal, that's really pretty cool.
Okay, so my final questions to you are, what is your favorite coffee, and when was the last time you broke something in your lab?
Okay, so I'm an indiscriminate coffee drinker. I'll drink any damn near anything. And I don't care whether it's Diet Coke, Diet Pepsi, or either, right? Like, I'm not, whatever caffeine you've got, I'll take it. In terms of what have I broken in so I don't have a wet lab, so it's not about pieces of equipment, although I do have a really funny story about breaking equipment in a wet lab. This was a long time ago now. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't tell this. Well, it was 25 years ago, so it was actually my now husband's. I was helping him do some of his analyses back when I was still a science student, and it involved an advanced slike machine. You guys don't know what advanced slike machine is, but it was this really complex way to complex machine full of mercury as a way to measure partial pressure of oxygen in blood samples, and he was, as part of his graduate work, needed to do that in blood samples. Anyway, we ended up breaking one of the stopcocks on this really complicated piece of machinery, and of course that meant that we spilled mercury everywhere. So that was a mess, and I'm not disclosing how we cleaned up the mercury mess. Not gonna do it. So you don't really break things in dry labs, but you do screw up all the time. And I mean, that's the other thing you've got to get ready for, right? Like, if you can't handle screwing up, don't go into research. But we screw things up all the time. We'll screw up code. We think we figured out, oh, we got the code running, this analysis is working, and then you're looking at it going, no, that's not right. And you got to go back and do it again. So anyway,